Excellent. Well, it looks like we'll have everyone that will be joining us today. Again, thank you as we begin our panel here today at the WGD Conference 2021. And we're so excited to have both of you. Again, our panel today is the Masculinities and Engaging Men in Conversations on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. So in our panel today, similar in our keynote session, please drop your questions in the chat. We'll be collecting those and give both of our two amazing panelists an opportunity to respond to those questions at the end of the session. And continue to follow us on Twitter, updating us as well. Your updates following us actually in the chat. And today is my esteemed pleasure to briefly welcome both of our panelists that we have joining us today. We'll be hearing first in our session from Dr. Gary Barker. Gary is the president and CEO of Promundo US. I'm happy to have him join us today. And then our second panelist in our session today is Laxman Belbase, who is the global co-director for the MenEngage Alliance. And again, we're so happy to have both of us join us this afternoon or morning, wherever you are joining us from. Excellent. And again, so I'll without further ado, I'm going to join us to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Gary Barker. I'll give you a little bit more information. Gary is a leading global voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positive masculinities. He is the CEO and founder of Promundo, which has worked for 20 years in more than 40 countries, beginning in low-income areas of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Promundo's approaches have been incorporated into ministries of health and education around the world. Promundo is a global consortium with members in Brazil, the US, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Portugal. Gary is co-founder of MenCare, a global campaign working in 45 countries to promote men's involvement as caregivers, and co-founder of the MenEngage Global Alliance of more than 700 NGOs. He created and leads the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, Images, the largest ever survey of men's attitudes and behaviors related to violence, fatherhood, and gender equality. He is the co-author of the 2015 and 2017 State of the World's Fathers Reports. He advised the UN, the World Bank, numerous national governments, and key international foundations and corporations on strategies to engage men and boys in promoting gender equality. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gary.
Hey, Daniel. Thank you and colleagues for the invitation, and really excited to be here with Laxman to dialogue about how do we put accountable feminist allyship for engaging men into practice. What does that look like? So I'm going to talk a little bit about some program and research ways that we do that. And I know Laxman is going to talk about the political activism and how we keep that work as well accountable to the women's rights field. I'm going to start off using the 2-minute film that Daniel, you have at your fingertips to sort of give some faces to what this work looks like, and then I'll talk about where that came from.
Minha mãe, uma vez, quando ele bateu na porta, minha mãe abriu, ele estava alcoolizado, estava bêbado e deu soco. Tinha que mostrar que ele era homem.
بمجتمعنا بطبيعة الحال الرجل هو رأس المرأة، يعني هي الفكرة اللي موجودة، والمرأة هي تابعة للرجل.
mbese abanza kuvuga ati niba umwohereje ku ishuri kikaba ikindi kibazo, numva cya gikomere cyanjye kirazamutse.
පිරිමියාය මේම තමයි ඉන්න ඕනේ. ඒ කියන්නේ ගේනුගේ වැඩ කරන්න කොහොමත් අකමැත්තේනේ. ඒ වුණාට මට මම අම්බ කරලා දෙනවා. එයා ගෙදර ඉඳලා කරනවා. ඒ ඔක්කොම එයා බලාගයි.
Eu ficava dentro do meu quarto, digamos assim, trancadão. Isso aqui ninguém mexe. A partir daquele momento ali, eu vendo a história de cada aquilo ali me serviu para que eu pudesse ser curado daquilo.
මට ඉස්සරලාම පොඩ්ඩක් ලැජ්ජ වුණා. මේ මාස 3ෙම ගියා වගේ. වෙන එකක් මගේ තුල එඟට ආවා වගේ දැනුණා.
وبنتعامل بنتعاون مع بعضنا. وقتها هي بتكون أنا عندي شغل هي بتهتم أكتر، وقتها هي بتكون عندها شغل كمان أنا بهتم.
umukobwa we mu buhe buryo nyamara n'umukobwa wanjye nkumva ni ibintu nawe bimushimye kuba yarahindutse bifite umusaruro ushimishije.
Essa ferramenta é poderosa diante de uma comunidade de transformação. Ela não vem de um monte, ela vem pingo, 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 então torna aquele rio forte.
I think folks may have missed some of the subtitles there, but I know we can provide the link after. What I wanted to show in that, and I'll talk about where some of the work came from and what has been a key principle to it, is seeing that this work with men and boys is not, doesn't sit alone. It is always in relation to and accountable to, or that is our goal, that is always accountable to the work with women and girls and to feminist principles. And I think what you saw very much in that film, and our research has followed the same approach, is to listen and include and always center the voices of women and girls in the work, as we also listen to men and their lived realities. Promundo's work, as Daniel mentioned, comes initially out of Brazil. And I'm pleased that kind of different than the usual development paradigm where international organizations based in the global north bring ideas, oftentimes that's the flow of resources. Our work came out of, and I'm a co-founder of the organization with key women's rights advocates, folks coming out of the HIV field, the LGBTI plus field in Brazil, and folks in public health, saying we needed to look at a way of engaging men as allies in this work in concrete ways. And our work started off as community-based, and we still do a lot of community-based work. But several years into that, we started to work very much with a research and advocacy lens to say we needed to trouble, to question, to engage a lot more in research about where men are in terms of gender equality. Many of the stories and the examples that we've been doing around engaging men as caregivers came out of a survey that we began in 2008 called the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, or IMAGES. It's one of the, I think it's fair to say, one of the most complex surveys on men. It's been carried out now in 45 plus countries, close to 70,000 interviews with, and this is important to affirm, with women and men in the same settings, asking men about their lived experience, asking women about their lived experience, never doing interviews in the same households for reasons of ethics and protection, but interviewing women and men in the same setting so that we hear realities about gendered attitudes, life experience, outcomes that include caregiving and health, gender-based violence, economic injustices, employment situation, et cetera, putting those in that relational perspective. A couple of headlines for that and how that has driven some of what we do, both at the program level and at the advocacy level. Far too many questions for me to go into all the data, and it's certainly on our website, and I can provide some links. But first, how much early childhood experiences matter, what boys and girls witness at home, whether violence or more equitable participation by a man at the house, in the house, whether father or another male caregiver, matters a huge amount. Boys who witness violence growing up, for example, we find consistently are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to use violence against a female partner later on. Women who witness such violence at home are also more likely to be in violent relationships later on. On the other hand, men who witness fathers or other male figures who are equitable in their decision-making, participate in some hands-on care, are 1.5 times more likely to do that in the future. Women who tell us that their father or another man was more active in the household and promoted equitable decision-making, they have more empowered views about their roles in the world as well. We've used these findings to say, where are there cracks and resistance to hegemonic or harmful ideas of masculinity? There is certainly no shortage of violence and oppression and men's wielding of power over women as we look at our data across the world. But at the same time, there's lots of negotiating of ways that we can push back against harmful ideas of masculinity. We find that lots of men tell us their views about what they think manhood should be are different than what they may view their prevailing community view to be. So again, the possibility of agency and autonomy, and for men to individually and collectively push back against harmful ideas about masculinity. We've also used the data to design programming. One of the things was finding out where are, it's one thing to go into a public health setting or maternal and child health or reproductive health and say, where are the men? Another way is to flip the question around and say, where do they show up in ways that women find useful and ways that they find engaging? We find that lots of men go to prenatal visits around the world, but they often stay in the waiting room, or they may be in the parking lot or outside. We use that data to challenge and engage Brazil's Ministry of Health, which had made years of engagement around women's health, still lots of things to be done, a set of programs around individuals, around LGBTI plus individuals, an impressive children's health program, but really men in terms of primary care were largely absent. We used images data and said, how could we get men to go from the parking lot, from the waiting room, to be part of the consultation when the woman wanted that? That decision is hers. The right to have him there is hers to decide. Developing a screening protocol, so if there's violence, services are brought to bear in that case. If not, and she wants him there, we worked with the Ministry of Health to come up with a protocol to say, how can we engage men in meaningful ways in that? That protocol became the Prenatal Men's Protocol. As of 2017, it was being rolled out on a national level in more than 4,000 primary healthcare units. We worked with the ministry to develop an online training tool that's been used by more than 20,000 professionals. Survey the ministry did in 2017 found that 3/4 of male partners were coming into the consultation room with women when women wanted them to come. For the 1/4 who weren't there, this is already screened for situations of violence, which certainly do exist, assuming she wanted him there. Of the 1/4 who didn't come, it was mostly because work, he could not get the time off, or at least that's what men said. 2/3 of the men who went into the waiting room were able to accompany their partner during birth, and about half of those were actually in the birthing facility, that is in where the birth took place. That's a huge leap from about 20 years back, where fewer than 10% of Brazilian men were present during childbirth. These are small gains in some ways, but they're also very important for setting a scene that we expect and want men to be present as caring, nonviolent partners who see their role from the beginning, whether it's the hands-on care work at home and of their children, but also part of health issues, well-being issues that affect them. So I give that as one example. In Rwanda, we've also used where we carried out images as well. I've been working with the Ministry of Health on a group education model. It's a 16-session parent training model that also uses the prenatal visit as a screening moment, a moment to invite in. We did a randomized control trial with the first round of that with 1,200 couples between control group and intervention group. The intervention group is half the sessions are men only, half the sessions are with the couple. Also screening for violence and have referrals in cases where that happens, but found dramatic impact in terms of reductions in violence reported by women. About 40% less violence in the intervention group reported by women at baseline, at post-test, following up 2 years later. Increased participation by men in caregiving activities in the home, increased participation by men in the number of prenatal visits, and a reduction in alcohol use, which is both a drain at times on family resources as well as sometimes a trigger for gender-based violence. As a result of this, we did a follow-up an additional 2 years later. That was during COVID. This was carried out last fall with 500 couples, 250 in the control, 250 in the intervention. Those changes held up 4 years later. And during the stress of COVID, if we look at income loss, and we know globally the spike in men's violence against women that's happened, we saw that the couples who were in the intervention group, and again, the intervention was 4 years previously, showed lower violence during COVID, lower alcohol use, lower stress with both couples. So again, we talked with both men and women. I give those as examples of the importance of doing this in a relational perspective. We want to see men finding benefits in it, but also knowing that they're accountable, that they're in a relationship, that we as, whether it's the public health system, communities, whether it's listening to the voices of women, that there's an accountability aspect, but it is trying to do that dual of calling men out when there is harm, but calling men in as well to the benefits of gender equality. Qualitatively, what we've heard both with women who say their partners are coming to the prenatal visits in Brazil, as well as women who have participated in this group session in the group sessions in Rwanda, is how the relationship has improved. And they don't only refer to that in the sense of more equitable decision-making, reduced couple violence of all kinds, better sharing of household resources, but also saying the quality of the relationship, their connection, their degree of intimacy with their partner as improving. Men often tell us the same thing. And I think it is important to acknowledge that as an outcome that we care about as well, that we can think both about the rights and the equality we can achieve, but also about quality of life and helping men see themselves as beneficiaries as well of a more gender just society. As a result of the randomized controlled trial and those results in Rwanda, the Ministry of Health is now the owner of that intervention, which is what we want it to be. We've done a scale up in one district and training 400 community health promoters who are part of the Ministry of Health. And the idea is to use that scale up experience to take it to the national level. Lots of work still to be done, but it could be the first country that has a nationally available parent training program that focuses with a gender transformative lens like this. I'm probably running out of time. Daniel, tell me how I'm going. How am I doing? You're on mute.
Just kind of 1 more minute to wrap up.
Okay, great. Just one other piece I'll bring into there is with that finding that I shared from images about violence begets violence. We certainly know that, and lots of other researchers as well have found that. That is never to be seen as an excuse for men's use of violence or anyone's. That is a reality in terms of what we know about the traumatic experience of witnessing and experiencing violence growing up. What that's allowed us to ask about is to say, we need to continue our broad scale campaign work and our broad scale prevention work that is available to all men, so that all of us as men are part of ending men's violence against women. But it also tells us that we've had to think about a trauma lens. Some of our work in post-conflict setting, but not only. We've done some work to bring a trauma lens with a masculinities understanding, particularly trying to reduce the stigma of men asking for help, of men being able to acknowledge violence that they witnessed growing up and the vulnerabilities that can create, and helping break that cycle of violence with a lens and with specific services for men who either experience violence in the context of conflict or who witnessed it at home. And I'm thrilled, I'm pleased to say, I think is a better word, that the model that we developed was done first together with partners in DRC, in the eastern part of the country, in North Kivu. We're working in a setting very that's experienced and experiences ongoing violence from the conflict there. That model, we have worked with both with our office in Brazil and also partnered in the US with a grant from NIH to bring a trauma-informed model from DRC to the US, working in communities affected by police violence and with high rates of homicide in Pittsburgh. So I just offer those as examples. I want to end now, but to say how we've used research from this relational perspective, understanding men's lived experience, women's lived experiences, using that to try to design some program interventions and trying to, within those, keep that accountable relational lens. And then work with partners, and Laxman is co-director of MenEngage, and then also with our Men Care campaign to try to take lessons like that and say, where do we go on policy with this? Where do we go with structural changes that we need? It's one thing to try to embed this across a Ministry of Health. How do we change the economic realities that shape so much of women's and men's lives to do this work as well? So let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing from Laxman on as well. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gary. And again, everyone continue. I've seen a few questions come into the Zoom chat. Continue to post your questions there so we continue to engage both Gary and Laxman in a conversation. So also now, I do want to turn to introduce our second panelist, already, as we mentioned earlier, Laxman Belbase, who is the co-director for the global co-director for the MenEngage Alliance. So again, Laxman is a social worker, a gender justice activist, with a Master of Science degree and more than 17 years of experience in program development, implementation, advocacy in the field of gender equality, child rights, and social justice at national, regional, and global levels. But prior to joining MenEngage, Laxman worked for Save the Children Sweden for 7 years as global gender and health advisor based in Stockholm, and represented Save the Children on the MenEngage Global Governance Board. Laxman is a founding core group member of MenEngage Alliance in Nepal and has contributed to strengthening of the alliance in various capacities at national, regional, and global levels, including by coordinating MenEngage Alliance in South Asia from 2009 to 2013. Having worked with national, regional, and global organizations, Laxman brings his multicultural experiences to the areas of gender equality, child protection, violence prevention, engaging boys and men for social justice, fatherhood, sexual and reproductive health and rights, comprehensive sexuality education, and human rights advocacy across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. With that, I'll turn it over to Laxman. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Katie, for that background. So should we run the video and then I'll build on to that. So what we wanted to do is to, just present you a summary of, currently we have our third global symposium ongoing.
Gender equality is not an issue of women and girls only. It is the fight for the development of the community.
Create meaningful, just communities, and that to me means it has to be about transformative masculinity.
We have to target behavior change. We have to support transformation of masculinities, and we need to connect the individual engagement with the systemic change we're fighting for.
Los hombres somos los beneficiados de este sistema patriarcal y somos quien tenemos que ayudar a terminar con eso.
You can't improve the lives of others if your life is, deteriorating as time goes by. So it's very, very important to rely on others. Collaboration is a major key.
Age does not matter. What matters is what you have in mind and what you want also to do or to achieve, or what your contribution can be.
Que los hombres no callen, combatan y cambien y no toleren. Es la única manera que vamos a poder conseguir realmente un cambio. ¿Qué queremos? ¿Cada vez más hombres en las prisiones o la prevención de la violencia?
Comment les hommes peuvent exprimer en fait leur alliance, leur soutien aux côtés des femmes si eux-mêmes les impacts des violences qu'il y a eu dans leur vie ne sont pas résolus.
We should not say do not leave someone behind, leave no one behind. We should ask, why are we leaving some people behind?
Patriarchy has tricked us into thinking that romantic love is the highest form of love, and it is not. The greatest form of love is solidarity. Your silence will not protect you. Speak up, use your space, use your voice.
Let's step up and intensify and disseminate the feminist orientation of this work and thus its ability to make change.
Necesitamos multiplicarnos. Necesitamos crear espacios de formación de recursos humanos, tanto académicos como de otro tipo.
I think compassion and mindfulness are extremely important. It's not only what we do, it is about how we do it.
It's not okay that we're leaving men still not doing their share of the care work, not supportive of women's economic empowerment. We've got to tie our work much more to economic justice.
Youth movements also show us what the future looks like. And that's what we need to do, is work together and be a true allies for our own and each other's movements. If they can't step up, if we can't lead, if we can't follow our work, get out of the way.
We need to look far more at the idea of having less principles, maybe, and focusing more on practice. And how do you take those principles to practice? As long as there's resistance, there is hope.
Thank you. So that kind of summarizes what I wanted to share today, building on to what Gary just shared with us as well on the practical examples of the work. And this is the story that we can hear from over 900 members of MenEngage Alliance. So MenEngage Alliance is a global civil society and social change network consisting of its members across 74 countries around the world, doing similar works, as Gary was mentioning, in a number of areas of work. So in the area of GBV prevention, sexual and reproductive health and rights, LGBTIQ rights, climate justice and youth leadership and engagement, women, peace and security, and more we are gearing to integrate more on racial justice issues, so that we can look into this aspect, from a systems change perspective, and connect the dots with this individual behavioral change program, SPC programs, into looking at then connecting the dot to make the systemic transformation that is needed in order to sort of, aspire towards the feminist vision of equality in the work we are doing. And that is where I think the issue of making this work more political becomes important, is we are not just trying to bring men on board, and men would take on some of the softer roles as it is understood, or softer issues on board, but do not engage themselves in really difficult conversations such as bodily autonomy, right to abortion for women's decision making on their own body, safe and legal abortion, LGBTIQ rights, and so on. And recently, again, with the climate crisis situation and the conversation, it has become so political, so that we can connect the dots with the behavior and the way patriarchal systems that has been upheld by patriarchal power and privilege, the injustices that are being, brought up. And we are more and more becoming clearer on the roles, the role that patriarchy plays in all of these injustice and inequalities that are being created around the world. And I think, in terms of looking at some of the aspects of how do we really engage or bring men on board, to start with, is a brilliant question. And it has to be a multiple strategies to look at. And it depends on what are the areas or the topics that you are engaging in. So, for example, one that Gary shared about is to look at, hey, how does your relationship look like with your partner and kids, to look at entering as from a fatherhood perspective. But there are other areas with regards to other thematic areas, looking at what has been your experiences with violence, moving into GBV conversation, right? Or what has been, let's look at your health, can be then lead into SRH conversations with the anxieties around sexuality, or the body of issues around with boys and men, and slowly then moving that. But I think the field, when it comes to engaging boys and men in gender equality, has moved for the conversation of why to more looking at how are we doing it, is becoming a most important question these days. And that how needs to be what we are calling as MenEngage globally, needs to be feminist informed, gender transformative, and human rights based how answering. So when we talk about engaging men and boys in this equation, we need to be clear on what is it that we are intending to do with this engagement or with this work with boys and men. That needs to be clearly laid out from the very beginning. And that vision needs to be informed from the feminist vision of equality and feminist agenda as such. So it cannot, and hence, yes, I think looking at trauma-centric approach is a very good entry point, but that approach needs to connect with the broader social change and transformation agenda, so that we don't delve into, and what we have seen in the gender equality work is to indulge in a conversation and discourse that puts again in the binarizing the kind of issues that we are looking into, maybe it vulnerability, maybe it engagement, maybe it's privilege and power, as if those power and powerlessness, vulnerability and privileges work in very binary ways. Actually, it's very complex than that. And to unpack and bring that to the surface when we work and engage with boys and men, that needs to be very clearly laid out. And then also to look at, again, by this work, the essence of the work is to question the gender power relationship. And hence the work with boys and men needs to be always informed by the analysis of gender power relationship and looking into the power privilege that we all men carry, irrespective of our identities. And again, sort of identities, we have to question and help men and boys to really reflect on the power and privilege we have at different levels, and complexify, the bringing in the complexity. So maybe the experiences at the individual and interpersonal level could be very different than what exists in the larger, broader societal, phenomena. So while we talk about how patriarchy impacts the life of men and boys or male identified individuals in that sense, at an interpersonal and individual level, could be very different than how it gets translated at the systemic and systems level. And that needs to be contextualized in the context that we are in, because those manifestations, those relationships vary from context to context. The reason I'm bringing this up is in the broader social development or international development or even gender equality work, most of the work, as Gary was also saying, tend to be very top down in terms of the program's development and implementation and the solutions to the problems that we are looking at to address. So those solutions cannot follow the same colonial approach or Eurocentric approach kind of modality in the work. The work needs to be embedded and analyzed in the local context, and hence the expertise, the local women's rights organizations, the feminist organizations, networks in those countries in specific places have to be involved in designing the programs. We need to challenge that phenomena that we have all been part of somehow, that we will get money from Global North, the solutions will come from Global North, and then the Global South people will receive those grants and do as we will tell them to do, right? So I think that challenge, that needs to be challenged at all levels these days, and hence the issue of decolonization in this kind of work needs to be at the center as well. So that's also, and then what we are also not trying to do and also prevent to do as much in this work is putting men into pedestal. So again, we are not trying to ask and bring men on board to, sort of lead the work or take the leadership and occupy this space, but rather be involved in this and take on responsibility to take on, sort of take on some of the backlashes or the fundamentalism ideas that are emerging, so that we can add value to what the feminist movement has been asking. And I'm not trying to monolithize the feminist movement either. Feminist movement is hugely diverse, and we need to resonate and connect with that diversity. And I think acknowledge and build onto that diversity we have, so that we can make sense in different contexts and issues that we are looking at. And I think, and one thing that, one of the speakers in the video you saw, Niara Jai from Zimbabwe, and I'll stop after this point, really brought this question, and which really triggered and shook us was, actually, we have a big problem of good men doing nothing. So I think the work with boys and men is, we are not trying to just produce men who would nod head when they are in the conversation with us or with you, but then do nothing beyond that room or that space. We want men to go and translate these conversations, and that, which is the theme of this conversation as well, translating theories into practice. And when we talk about masculinities in engaging boys and in conversations on gender equality, we also want to make it clear that that conversation should lead to practical actions, whether it's in your own home, the relationship you have immediately, to the spaces you occupy, and the organizations you are part of. How would those conversations get turned into specific practical examples that can then lead on a step-by-step level towards the feminist agenda of equality and gender justice. So I think that all needs to be connected and challenged, and that is quite a process. I'm explaining you very simply, but it's a very complex phenomena or process that one has to go through to unpack on what this means, and also to prevent of coming from very explicitly that we will achieve this change in 1 year project or 2 year project. Project approach will not lead us to any equality or gender equality vision. We have to come with a movement building programmatic lens in the work we are doing, and hence the resources, the intention, and that's specifically also to the donors, is we won't change men in 1 year project or 2 year project. It requires a bit more time and space and long-term investment in the work we intend to do. it's better not to do if you are coming at from a project perspective. And I'll stop there.
No, excellent. Thank you so much, Laxman, for that powerful statement, closing our structured panel today. And again, I just want to thank both of you for joining us this morning, this afternoon. Please continue to post your chats, your questions in the chat box. We are picking those up. And building on a question from one of our attendee members, I guess this question is to both of you, but the order you address. So Laxman, what you had mentioned is that the importance of getting good men moving from not doing anything, getting them to move into practice. What have both of you found as effective strategies, either than working with men or in your own life, that of that self-reflection, the self-reflective practice, that self-thinking to spur that action, to engaging men into higher levels to do gender work?
Gary, you want to go? So what we mean by the problem with good men is, so this phenomena that we also observe between and among the groups of men is to say that the problematic men are out there, it's not me. And sort of isolating ourselves from actually seeing ourselves and being accountable to what is happening at the systemic level, and not feeling responsible as individual men, or if you are male identified, to actually call that out and to say that, oh, it's their problem, those men's problem, those are the main problem, and I'm not the problem, and hence you need to talk to them, and getting away from that responsibility. So I think what we mean by the problems with good men is that yes, I will say I never use violence, I'm very good father, I'm very good partner, or whatever relationship we have, I'm very good in my office space and so on. But I do not call out the kind of misogyny and sexism that exists in my own family, in my own society, among my friend circle, right? I remain silent. So yes, I may have changed my mindset, but I'm not practicing to challenge to achieve the vision that I have in mind as a collective. And I think that's where I think we need to be little mindful as male identified individuals to take on that responsibility and become more proactive in calling them out. So that's one element that we really need to be mindful of and ensure that we bring that urge and bring that energy among boys and men to be involved and be part of the broader mobilization. And then another point also that I want to bring up, which also we see as a major challenge in the work, is sometimes, for example, especially we also seen that during the COVID situation, the feminist movement always opposed the authoritarian paradigm that most of the governments around the world approached, or use a war analogy to fighting against coronavirus. And the feminist movement was quite critical of it. But one of the critiques of some of us is some of us is actually that some groups of men felt that it's too dangerous for them to be involved in pushing back against the state, right? And hence the men and boys the groups were not heavily involved in supporting feminist movement who are challenging the state to be part of the same movement. And hence sort of bringing a challenge in terms of what exactly are we trying to do with the groups of boys and men, or those working on transforming masculinity. Because if we are looking at transforming system, and how we can bring that up more, and that becomes part of the accountability. If we are not taking up that responsibility, then what is the vision we are looking at? Why are we then working with boys and men? Becomes again a circling back question. So I think I'll stop there, and Gary, if you want to add.
Sure, and thanks, Laxman. I fully agree on the, how do we engage, empower, demand that men speak up and call out other men. I think the other part that, and to understand how much we are often raised as boys and men not to question ideas about manhood and power and privilege. One of the ways that privilege works and how patriarchy works is to make it invisible that we who carry that privilege even notice it. Racism works in similar ways. Classism works in similar ways. So one is simply to help. I moved to Brazil inspired by Paulo Freire's approach and had the chance to work with some colleagues who were trained by him around that consciousness raising about how systems of power work and how we use that for a collective political practice, but also for an individual practice. The other half of that I think we often need to think about is how do we call men in to see that gender equality is not about we often get stuck in a hydraulic notion of power that we take away from one and give to the other instead of an interdependent notion of how do we all get better together. There's a really good book that's just out called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, writing about race in the US and her take on how do we, she is an African-American woman, she says very articulately, how do we talk about how racism as a system is part of capitalism and patriarchy and causes harm for all of us, while of course centering that on those who were formerly enslaved or descendants of formerly enslaved. And I think gender needs a lens like that as well, that we call men into the benefits that we will all have if we achieve a more equitable, caring, just society. And I think that's a part that we often don't do. And I wanted to make a point on, as you know, Laxman and I in our career have spent a lot of time doing the program work, but I won't speak for you, Laxman, but to say we've also spent a lot of time critiquing this idea of work with men or men's work. And I think the power of this, I presented an RCT that shows great data with a program model, but we're very aware and want to critique this development paradigm that says, let's, who's got the best RCT? What does a program model look like versus how do we break that program box? The change that we need for this is not, one great school-based curriculum. We need to trouble the school system and look at its, physical infrastructure and what it's missing. What happens inside the written curriculum and the unwritten curriculum? How do, just to take one locus of where we do this work. Let's look at the workplace that we work. How do we make, it's one thing to go in with our 45-minute trainings on harassment prevention, which is what's being done in many workplaces these days. It's another to say, let's make transparent wage differences between women professors and men. Let's make obvious the numbers of who's occupying what places of power in our workplaces. And then, I think the same holds with the health sector, et cetera. To this work to have its full revolutionary changing potential is to look at how power and privilege works in systems. And I think, I go back to that point of how to engage men as allies in this in a way that's not about doing a favor. It's not about, it is right because it is rights-based and it's the way the world needs to be. But I think it's also important that we want men to have a stake in it. When I start doing my share of the care work, I become a co-owner of how important care work is instead of just thinking my paid work outside the home is important. So I think that feminist principle of the personal is political is something we've got to find a way that men step into that we demand it of men. And that I think that we also try to, find examples of how men say, I've got a stake in a gender just world. This is about a huge inequality that we've not overcome, but also I want men to feel like I've got skin in this game. And I think, anyway, I think that's very much what the Ubuntu Symposium, I think is tried to, and even what we call it has been very much about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gary and Laxman, for sharing there on that. I think that powerful statement of the calling in and calling out. And again, we'll post a link. I think there that community Ubuntu Symposium, also looking out and reflecting those conversations and those power dynamics of when to speak up and working to engage. To kind of build one of our questions for our attendees, though, I guess first to you, Gary, is that we are working towards system level change, that revolutionary level change. But just even from your careers or experience or organizations, those approach in SBC programs, any of those moments just to kind of build initial engagement with men that you found effective or from different contexts, building some of the examples you mentioned earlier in Rwanda and Brazil, to those initial approaches to bring them into those conversations. There we go. Oh, I think you're still muted, Carrie.
Sorry, I had to respond to a quick email. Could I ask you to repeat the second part of the question? There was somebody who needed me to let them in.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, it's just building on that work. So what approaches have you seen to invite men in those SBC programs? How to an initial engagement, as we were talking about, those initial approaches to call them in to the conversations.
Yeah. I think the bottom line, and Laxman, from your program experience as well, I think it'd be great to hear from you on this one as well. We know that any of our approaches that are kind of voluntary participation by men coming to a discussion, a session, those are rare kind of spaces. They work in some very specific contexts. They work in Rwanda's got a, there was a way to make those available by engaging men through the prenatal visit, because we found lots of men came in the door. In Brazil, we could not get, if we called 20 women who came to a prenatal visit to ask if their male partner if she was engaged with him and wanted to include him, if he wanted to come to a group discussion, we would get 1 out of 20. Just the nature of men's lives meant that a group model did not make sense in the setting. There are still some of that happening, but unless we found more creative ways, which was changing the system itself, so the space he came and make it useful, to make it interesting and easy for him to come in the door, was really the way. And it was, in that case, it's obviously in the context of work with heterosexual couples where she was already using a universally available prenatal health visit. So I think we do have to, again, I'll go back to that. How do we break the program box? Because if we look at kind of, men's voluntary participation, there's not a lot of men that will say, hey, want to have, come have a conversation about pro-feminist politics. It's not our friends don't meet us at the bar to have those conversations for the most part. So it is about how do we use the things that are out there. We've been doing some partnerships recently with the Gina Davis Institute on looking at how masculinities. We did a study to look at how manhood is presented to boys in TV, complementing a lot of their work that they've been doing about how girls and women are presented, both behind the camera as well as on screen. And to say, how do we reach content creators? I had a conversation earlier this week with one of the big studios based in California that produces probably half of what our children are watching on TV, to say, how can they build messages in that? Like, how do we, I think that's what we've got to think about. That to me is where the work really needs to go. So we change, it's universal policies that we can build this in. There's a huge amount of women's empowerment and women's rights work, whether it's reproductive health or the whole field of social protection and women's economic empowerment, that we don't have to rebuild those to engage men. We need to look at them and say, how can we build and have indicators there? How can we make men visible in those spaces so that those become places where we engage men? Programs that have already, as part of governments, have become part of universal programming. I think that's where I see the work having a difference. I really think how many men can we recruit is probably not the question. We need this kind of in the water, and that means where is the water? Schools, workplaces, health sector, mass media. Where are the spaces where men already show up, and we can change the world around them and see how it filters in. So I think we started our work a lot with, hey, if we change their attitudes, they'll change their behaviors. I think we're coming a lot more with a question of, let's change policies and structures, and behavior change will often emerge from that.
Yeah, no, that's a million, if I can quantify for some reason, a brilliant question. But yeah, it also has to do with the overall objective of what your intention behind what you are going to initiate. So as I was mentioning, so there will be different entry points, and for that you will also have to understand the contextual social power dynamics and gender dynamics, because then actually I agree with Gary in terms of actually it's not so difficult to actually bring men in. The most challenging part in the program work that I have been involved for the last 17 years is to sustain those men's involvement and engagement. So in the beginning, they would come and listen to you, but if you can't sustain, if you can't keep up their interest in the conversation or the activism or the work you are doing, those men will just simply drop off, and you will be left with few men which which is even good, but I don't think it will solve to the purpose that you had in the beginning. So I think, and I think for some of the strategies, my request and suggestion would be that you have to get some conversation and thinking with the local feminist women's rights organizations who are already doing similar works, and they will be able to tell you what kind of strategies will be helpful. Because one thing we do have to acknowledge among those who are doing this work on engaging or working with boys and men, the work with boys and men initially, and some of us and most of us probably within MenEngage space come from the work I was brought up was by one of the feminist women's rights organization. I wasn't involved as men initially to, suddenly a bulb clicked and I said, I need to do something. I was oriented and brought into this space by feminist women's rights organizations and activists and leaders. So the work with boys and men, and that was one of the questions I had posed earlier with Daniel when we were invited, is I was asking if we should have a woman who is speaking with us today in this conversation, because this conversation is not about men talking to men or men coming and saying what is the best approach. It's about a common, all of us coming from our own expertise and engage in this conversation. So to say that it is not a men-only conversation that needs to happen, we have to have, as Gary was saying, it's not about, again, if we do that line, the challenge we will face is again reinforce the same gender binary as opposed to men versus women, right? That's not how relationships work. It is men and women and people of diverse identities, so that we push the boundary to challenge the gender binary and the way state or gender power relationship work, which always operates. Maybe you look at it, capitalist model, the fundamentalism, the religious fundamentalism, those are always come from creating an environment where we start looking at men versus women, right? Or men or women versus other identities. So we need to realize the politics behind why these kind of notions are always brought forward to put ourselves on the conversation of looking at men's movement or women's movement, but rather how can we then come together as allies. And that's where I'll come to one of the questions in the chat box, is that's what we try to clarify on how that coming together should look like, is what we are terming as accountability standards. So how that coming together should look like is the partnership and allyship that those who are working on men and masculinities work needs to have proper conversation and listening and learning from the feminist movement. One of the concerns that have come out recently with the work with boys and men and the kind of interest that is suddenly coming out on this work, also there is a given a sense that the resources and funding has moved from the feminist women's empowerment work to that of engaging boys and men, which is, in a way, if you look at it from a traction perspective and how the engaging boys and men conversation gets more and more spaces, probably yes. But in terms of the monetary element, it's partially yes, but there is a bigger question mark to really dig into. So I think we have to be nuanced in terms of looking at what that element means. And in the accountability standards, what we try to do is to outline what are those parameters when we say those working with boys and men are standing in allyship or in solidarity with feminist movement, what that allyship looks like. How should that allyship reflect? What is it that we need to be mindful of? Those are the standards that we try to outline. And also outline goes to looking at when we think about any strategies, think about any campaigns, what are the elements that we need to keep in mind when we think of in the beginning to start with, so that our initiative are informed by the broader feminist agenda, so that it gets and add value. We are not trying to create a parallel work with boys and men for gender equality, and then we don't talk with feminist movement. We are trying to challenge that approach, and so that and then the work with boys and men is, with this work, we are not trying to create a parallel men's movement. We are part of feminist movement, and I underline that, and we add value on transforming masculinities and bringing boys and men in the part of the solution, so that we can join hands together, challenge the system and dismantle the system together, so that we can really look and aspire towards the transformation that we are looking at, that is impacting the lives of women and girls, people of gender diverse identities, all the way to the planet we are living in. We are in an existential crisis right now, and the behaviors of the masculine, the capitalist model is at the root, which is heavily informed by patriarchy, heavily informed by the masculinities norm that is killing the planet as well. So hence the need for aligning with other rest of the injustice movements or justice movement, or however you frame it, and that we have to come together to push back against the pushback we are hearing. As UNSC Secretary General talks about, we have to push back the pushback we are receiving, right? Especially the feminist movement, and we saw that in COVID, how the little gains have been heavily pushed back again. So I will stop there, and I thought I address some of the questions as well.
No, thank you so much, Laxman. And unfortunately, we're getting our time together here has closed, but as all of you, I think, have heard, there is ample opportunities for all of you to continue this conversation. One of those immediately being the ongoing Ubuntu Symposium. And thank you again, Gary and Laxman, for sharing your perspective, your resources, and today, but also I think particularly highlighting how this work with engaging men and masculinities has to be embedded with ongoing efforts to advance gender justice and ensuring what allyship look like, but also ensuring principles of research are embedded. So again, I just want to thank you again one last time for joining us today here at the 2021 Women and Gender International Development Conference, your time. And again, we just dropped the link as well to return back to the plenary. But again, one last thank you. Please give with our virtual emoticons or a clap of the hand for Gary and Laxman. One last final thank you for joining us today. Excellent. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Laxman, great to see you again.
Yeah, same here. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah.
Take care,
Good
everyone.
luck with the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks,
All the
Laxman.
best. Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.